Okay, welcome everybody to Chatham House. Thank you so much for attending what's going to be a really fascinating hour-long discussion. We are delighted to welcome Rebeca Grynspan, the Secretary General of UNCTAD, the UN Trade and Development, and Sir Mark Lyall-Grant, a former UK National Security Advisor, and perhaps very pertinent to this discussion, former UK Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Now, before I introduce our speakers in more detail, let me just give you a bit of detail about this event. I'm Dr. Samir Puri. I'm the Director of Chatham House's Centre for Global Governance and Security. This event is on the record. It's being recorded and live streamed as well. If you would like to tweet or otherwise use social media referencing this event, please use hashtags @ChathamHouseEvents and @ChathamHouse. What we're going to do is spend about half an hour having a sort of discussion between the three of us on stage, sort of to whet your intellectual appetites before we hand over to you for the second half of this event. And of course, if you want to ask a question, just raise your hands. There'll be microphones brought to you. Please do introduce who you are, give us your name and tell us which organisation you represent or are affiliated to. I also have a laptop here for questions to arrive from our online audience. There's many more people also watching online. Really looking forward to hearing all of your comments and our discussion. This is really meant to be a free-flowing discussion among the panel. We're not really approaching this from the perspective of speeches and that sort of thing. So we're going to be able to cover, I think, quite a wide variety of topics. Now, I'm going to give a very short intro because there's a longer bio that you'll be able to access on the description for this event. Let me give you a quick introduction. So we're so thrilled to have Rebeca Grynspan here today. Secretary General, as I said, of the UN Trade and Development, UNCTAD. Rebeca is a Costa Rican economist and former Vice President of Costa Rica. She's a globally recognized leader in economic policy, diplomacy and multilateral cooperation. She has decades of service in international institutions and the UN system. And she's an influential voice on trade and human development. A few details about your prior career. Prior to joining the UN, your public service began in Costa Rica. You were elected vice president and you served in that position 1994 to 1998. And you've held key cabinet positions, housing, coordinator of economic and social affairs, and deputy finance minister. In September 2021, Ms. Grynspan was appointed Secretary General of UNCTAD, becoming the first woman to head the organisation in its 60-year history. In August 2025, the UN General Assembly renewed her mandate, acknowledging her role in reforming UNCTAD and enhancing the institution's role as a global voice for trade and economic development. Now, I'm going to also introduce Mark Lyall-Grant. He's, as I said, a former UK National Security Advisor. He enjoyed a very distinguished career as a British diplomat for many years. And he served as National Security Advisor to Prime Ministers David Cameron and Theresa May. Mark is revered as one of the UK's most senior public servants with over 3 decades of experience in public presentation, leadership, negotiation and policy making. And I think it's important, as I said, to also highlight for the purposes of this discussion, the 6 years Sir Mark spent as the UK's permanent representative to the UN, 2009 to 2015, if I remember correctly. So I'm going to start our discussion by asking you, Rebeca, your travel itinerary, I think, is almost like a visible depiction of international affairs and diplomacy. You've been in COP, you've left Brazil, gone to South Africa for the G20, you've come back to Europe, and we're delighted to have you here. What's the feeling in terms of as being a senior UN representative at a time when, of course, the UN is there's always scrutiny on the UN, but how have you sort of felt your sort of position and as a representative of the UN at these 2 big global summits?
Well, they are different ways to look at this. You know, on the one hand, even if you look at the General Assembly and, as you said, COP and the G20, you feel that the world wants to come together. Yes, in the General Assembly we had the numbers of heads of state coming to the General Assembly that we had pre-COVID, so it has recovered. So it shows a willingness to be there. We had our conference in October, and we had 170 registered delegations. This is almost universal, yes? It's the highest we have ever had in the UN Trade and Development. And when you go to COP, you still see, in a very difficult place to get to, because Belém was not easy, still thousands of people coming to the COP to try to get a consensus on how to go forward in terms of climate change. So on that sense, on the one hand, you hear multilateralism is in crisis. On the other hand, you feel that willingness of the multilateral institutions to continue to deliver. What happens in each of these places is ambitious enough for the challenges we have? I would say no. The challenges are stronger or bigger than maybe the consensus we are having, but still consensus show that there is a possibility of getting at least to minimums on collective behavior. And between these two, how to get to a more ambitious agenda and for a multilateral system that will be more fit for purpose, on the one hand, but on the other hand, also maintaining the willingness, the commitment of the world to build the multilateral system. Let me just say here to finish this that today, being a multilateralist means to be a reformist. You know, the world of today is very different from the world of 1945. And we need to embrace reform, to defend a multilateral space, but at the same time to make it fit for purpose for the 21st century.
And Rebeca, I'm going to stick with you for a moment to talk about UNCTAD in particular. Now, next week, you're launching the Trade and Development Report, which is a regular publication, as I understand it. Could you maybe tell us a bit about that report, whether there's any highlights you want to share, and where it fits into the previous answer you've given in terms of contributing to the multilateral system? Because obviously the world is, it need not be said, the world is in a grave state of anxiety for multiple reasons. So where does UNCTAD's work and where does this report sort of fit into those various anxieties? Will we be calmer or more anxious after we read it?
Both. Well, in a way, I think that in a world in flux like we are living, where we have contradictory forces coexisting, you need more evidence to try to understand not only one side of the picture, but really the complexity of the picture. I think that one of the things that we have tried to do in this, especially in these last 2 years, where things are changing so much in the area of trade, especially, you know, with protectionism, nationalism going up, the tariffs, uncertainty. So we have tried to give analysis and research and evidence that will allow people to see how these forces are interacting. Because there is this tendency to look at the world and think that everything is going in the same direction. And that is not true. As I said, contradictory forces are coexisting at the same time. And part of our evidence and research and analysis tries to tell also the story that we don't know exactly where we are going to land, and that will depend on what we do. It's not that there is forces that we don't control and then we will land somewhere without us doing anything. In each of us and in the organizations where we are in, and we can shape still what is going to happen. So let's try to understand the world in that complexity. I think that is important.
Brilliant. And I'm going to just ask you a follow-up on that before we go to Mark in a second. You know, it's so interesting what you're saying, and I think a lot of us will agree with you about that evidence base to have a more discriminating view rather than just being pessimistic. But in terms of trade, very specifically, there are so many pressures, and this year, the pressures have been almost, astonishing. in terms of the US's approach to tariffs and just the cascading second-order impacts of that, let alone the impacts on different economic calculations. How do you get your story heard? So you've talked about this story. How do you get it heard over the cacophony that is coming from, let's say you're sitting in New York, it's, you know, not that far to Washington, D.C., but one has a larger loudspeaker than the other. So how do you get your story heard?
Well, we are in Geneva.
Right.
So we have more distance.
Oh, good.
No, let me say, we tell a story in the Trade and Development report that we will launch next week. First of all, we tell the story of the resilience of trade, despite the uncertainty. Trade will be growing this year at around 4%. That is more than the growth of GDP. Yeah? So all the projections that we had at the beginning of the year that trade will collapse did not happen. In part, it didn't happen because the worst case scenario did not happen. You know, the US and China are still negotiating, and there is a negotiation process going on that is different from an open trade war. And so that's part of the reason why trade was resilient. There is part of this 4% growth that is front-loading of imports from the US because of, you know, anticipating the tariffs. A part of it is true, is front-loading. But the other part is the structural changes that we have seen in the economy. One of that changes is the multipolarity in trade. We have much more actors. Trade is more decentralized today than it was in the 20th century. We have the South-South trade, to give you an example. Yeah? South-South trade is today as important as North-North trade for the first time in 3 centuries. 30% each, you know, and 40% goes back and forth from the north to the south. South-South trade is growing at 8% per year, much more than the rest, the global trade. Even if you take China and you do the numbers without China, South-South trade is very dynamic. It's around even more than with China. It's 9% per year in the last year. So you have structural changes in the world. 70% of the growth of the economy in the next 5 years will come from the global south. So we have an economy that have diversified, that is more multipolar. The other part of it is AI, because what is growing also much more rapidly in trade is services, and also everything related to AI investment that needs trade, and that has been also a dynamic part of trade and a more structural also change. So we are seeing both. We are seeing a reaction to the current events, but we are seeing also structural changes that have made trade more resilient through time.
Such an interesting thing. We talk about a more multipolar world, but to actually see some of the evidence in changing trade patterns, one would expect this. Rising economies that 70 years ago were still coming out of colonial eras, and obviously now reaching different levels of maturation. Mark, I'm really interested to hear your responses to any of these themes, but also more generally where you see the UN system and the multilateral sort of art of diplomacy fitting into a world that is sort of less accommodating for it, but nonetheless vital.
Yeah, I don't think one should hide from the fact that multilateralism is in a little bit of trouble. We're going through a very bad time. The UN is going through a very bad time for reasons that are well known. It didn't start with Donald Trump, but he has certainly accelerated a process of more nationalistic, more populist approach, and is absolutely dead against multilateral diplomacy in any form. And that has caused quite a crisis for the UN system as a whole. I mean, just to put figures on it, you know, the United States is now $1.5 billion in arrears to the UN budget. Well, you know, the UN budget's not that big. You've got 3.5 billion for the regular budget, 5.3 or so for the peacekeeping. So this is a huge amount. And what is worse is that China has followed suit and is now also $600 billion in arrears. And that has had real life consequences across the UN system, with thousands of people being laid off. And so this is a crisis for the UN and a crisis for multilateralism. We've got to return to law of the jungle and might meets right. And that is a challenge that those who believe in the multilateral system, as obviously Rebeca does and as I do, are going to need to fight. And the people who are going to need to lead that, in my view, are the sort of 117 countries that came to the meeting. It's the small and medium-sized countries that depend more on a global system than the big beasts in the jungle, like Russia and the United States and China, because they clearly are moving in a slightly different direction. And if the smaller countries want to avoid having to say, we have to join this camp or we have to join that camp, then they're going to have to lean into the multilateral system that exists. Of course, as Rebeca says, it needs reform. There is a UN80 initiative. We've got various good ideas for reform. Some of the bigger ones won't work. Some of the smaller ones perhaps will, in terms of merging some of the agencies, greater accountability, less bureaucracy, etc. So the UN system needs to replenish, renew itself, but it needs the energy from the member states, because the UN is an intergovernmental body. It's not a supranational body like the European Union. It is an intergovernmental body. It depends on the member states. And of those member states, 5 of them have a very special status, and of those 5, 3 are not particularly interested in supporting the international multilateral system at the moment. So we are in a very challenging period, but I think there is, as Rebeca suggests, a possibility of things going on, and we shouldn't be too apocalyptic about it, because this isn't the first time that the UN system has been paralysed. It was paralysed for basically the first 40 years of its existence during the Cold War. There's only been a golden era, as I call it, of about 25 years from 1989 onwards. So it's not new that we're going to have these challenges from countries that don't really buy into the system, but it's going to take quite a shift and quite an effort if we're to get back to what I think most individuals and most countries, certainly, as I say, the small and medium-sized countries want, which is a global order where there are rules, where there are regulations, where you can negotiate in a secure legal environment. And the risk is that we're drifting away from that at the moment.
Thanks very much for that, Mark. And I want to sort of bridge those comments to this point about conflict and the UN's role in conflict, because it's an important point to remind ourselves that even if Trump might have come up with a sort of putative Gaza peace plan, it then went to the UN for certification.
Absolutely.
Now, no matter what that certification significance is seen subjectively by this US administration, it still went in that direction. Now, Rebeca, you'll probably have some interesting reactions to Mark's comments there, but you were actually involved in the Black Sea grain deal involving Russia and Ukraine. It's a really important, I think, example of where the UN can actually play a role even in a major war between countries. Maybe just tell us a bit about your role, your experience of that, and maybe if you want to talk about Russia, Ukraine more broadly, feel free.
Yeah, I think that the Black Sea Grain Initiative is a good example. When we take more risks, we do much more, yes? And probably we need in the UN to take more risks to be at the table, yes? And the Black Sea is a good example. We were in the middle of the war, and at the beginning of the war, the Black Sea, that is a very important maritime road for food security in the world, because Ukraine and Russia are breadbaskets of the world. And what happened at the beginning is that was curtailed. So Ukraine couldn't export any grains to the world, and we saw the effect on trade and on the food prices. Food prices skyrocket during that time. And so the Secretary General took the risk to go to Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky and say, maybe we can do something here to open a corridor for the export of grain through the Black Sea that is essential for precluding a food crisis in the world. I will give you some numbers about that, but it's important. So I led the negotiations with Russia, and Martin Griffith led the negotiations with Ukraine. And at the end, we had 2 documents that we signed in Turkey, with the help of Turkey, that was a very important partner on this. And we signed a memorandum of understanding between Russia and the UN, and an agreement with the same agreement signed in different papers because they never signed together, Russia and Ukraine, but it was the same wording to allow for a process of exporting through a corridor in the Black Sea for Ukraine grain to be able to go out, and in the memorandum of understanding with Russia to make possible the exceptions that most of the sanctions included, that was to exempt food and fertilizers from the sanction regime for Russia. And so what happened is that when this went on for 1 year, and in that year, and that's an example of what you wanted to say, on that year, the food index, the World Food Index, went down 23%. Let me tell you what that means. For each 1% increase in the food index, there will be 10 million people more below the poverty line, according to the research of the World Bank. So we brought down the index 23%. So you can see there the issue of prevention, because in a way, everybody looked at the Black Sea like a humanitarian issue. It was humanitarian because of prevention, not because we wanted to take for the World Food Program to buy the grain and take to the places where the grain was needed. That was important. But the most important thing was to restore trade of food for people not to fall under the poverty line, not to fall into a food crisis. And so this was a huge effort from our side. It was the only agreement we have signed between Russia and Ukraine, and in the middle of the war, because I remembered, the next day we signed the agreement, there was a bombardment very close to the port of where the grain was going to be exported. And so everybody got panicking, and the press said, well, that the agreement is over. And we said, no, the agreement is not over. We made an agreement in the framework of a war. This was not a peace agreement. It was an agreement that specifically wanted to achieve the restoration of food trade, and then for prices to go down. And it's a very good example. It was a difficult thing. The memorandum of understanding with Russia that I led, we administered the memorandum for 3 years. It just came to an end last June of this year. And we continue to have the conversation and the dialogue with Russia and with Ukraine during all this time, despite the fact that Russia withdrew from the agreement 1 year after. But trade continued since then, and prices have been pretty stable at that moment. That doesn't mean all the problems were solved. For example, there were important countries that suffered because internal food prices still went up, even if international prices went down because of the exchange rate and things like that. But really, this was a huge contribution to the world, and was done by the UN. I think that the legitimacy of the UN and the idea, and because we had partners, and in this case, Turkey played a major role. So it's possible. You know, it's possible to take risk. It's possible for the multilateral system really to prevent and to mediate. And here is the two words that are important. Mediation and prevention has to be part of our DNA.
And most optimistically, I mean, no one knows if the guns will fall silent. Obviously, everyone's watching avidly to see what happens with the negotiations. But the idea that the UN may play interesting roles to facilitate certain specific things in that event it has unique attributes. Now, I want to.
Most of the people that came to me at that time said this will never happen. Yeah. Nobody believed when we started that that was going to happen. And we had, I have to say that I had to negotiate with the US, with the UK, with the European Union, that were the three sanction systems. At the beginning, everybody looked at me like a crazy person trying to do this. It was difficult. There were difficult negotiations. But again here, Samir, something that you said, we put forward the evidence, what was happening in the markets. We partnered with the private sector. We asked them, what is happening? They gave us a lot of information and a lot of intelligence. So we put together really an effort that was difficult, but it was really worthwhile.
Listening to you, you certainly get the sense that one of the vital characteristics is optimism. In order to actually use those levers and maneuver the UN. I want to move on to a slightly different topic before we hand over to Q&A, which is next year, of course, the UN will have a new Secretary General. And Rebeca, the interesting thing is you have been nominated by your nation, Costa Rica, for this process. And I really want to, and I think we'll all be very keen to hear, what is it like being nominated for UN Secretary General? What is the process? I mean, there's some factual parts about the process I suspect people will be interested in anyway. But just maybe tell us a bit about your journey and where you're sitting right now in that journey and what you're looking forward to as that progresses next year.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me tell you about the process a little bit, and then I will tell you about me. Precisely yesterday, the letter asking for formal nominations have gone out. And this is a letter that has to be agreed between the President of the General Assembly of the UN and the President of the Security Council. That is, the Security Council, I don't know if everybody here is knowledgeable about it, is 15 countries conform the Security Council, 5 permanent members that have veto power, that are the US, China, Russia, UK, and France, and 10 members that rotate between the membership of the UN. But in many parts, when you will read about it, they will be called the E10. And the others are the P5, the permanent 5. This is the Security Council. So they had to agree on the terms in which this process will be carried on. And that agreement was finalized yesterday, and so the letter asking for the nominations or postulations from all members of the UN were asked for. So the race is on. What will happen during this period of time? There will be hearings, and the countries have to present the candidates, and the candidates have to give a vision statement, and then they will be invited to informal hearings and formal hearings with different parts of the UN membership in the General Assembly, and more importantly, obviously, in the Security Council. Because is the Security Council the one that present their proposal, the person that they want for the selection of the person for the Secretary General, is the Security Council the one that present one name to the General Assembly. So the Security Council, in a way, is a big part of the decision process. And 9 votes from the Security Council are necessary for that to happen, for the person to be selected, and no veto has to be there.
How many candidates are there? Do you, how many candidates are there altogether? Do we
there
know
will
already?
Be many.
We don't know the exact number yet.
No, we don't know yet. For the moment, there are 3 candidates that we have already declared.
Right.
Michelle Bachelet, from ex-president of Chile, Rafael Grossi, that is the candidate of the interagency, the Agency on Nuclear Energy, and myself. Yeah. We have declared that we will run, but there will be more.
And of course, one of the important points about the post of the UNSG is it's not yet been held by a woman. And Mark, I want to bring you in here because when you were at the UN, so Ban Ki-moon was renewed in his tenure, I believe, but how do you see the post? Because obviously the post is always, it's a very, to say it's challenging is somewhat trite, but I think obviously now it's going to require something very different, isn't it, to make it work? How do you see the post having evolved?
I mean, Rebecca has set out the formal process. Of course, the real process is a little bit different. The reality is that the P5 decide on the Secretary General. And as a result of that, whatever the other processes that are put in, and I think a lot of the developments that have happened in the last sort of 20 years have been positive in terms of having to present a mission statement, going to the hustings in the General Assembly, all that plays a role. But at the bottom case is that the P5 have a veto. Now, I think it's fair to say that for France, the most important thing is that the candidate speaks French. So that's, I don't know how your French is, Rebecca, but you won't get approval unless your French is adequate for the French. Then you have the Russians and the Americans, and they will want someone who is not going to cause them major difficulties. Because in their minds, in the treaty, and it is in the treaty, the Secretary General is more Secretary than General. Doesn't have the formal powers of the President of the EU Commission, for instance, have much more powers than the UN Secretary General. The UN Secretary General is the servant of the member states. It's an intergovernmental body. And that means that you're the servant of the P5. So what you've had in the past is that candidates have to go to all 5 capitals, try and seek approval. And in that process, they have to make offers, concessions. Now, sometimes that will be bargaining on senior jobs at the UN. The British government's not opposed to mentioning names when the Secretary General is looking for approval in that respect, but all the P5 are very similar on that, or on their views on particular issues of national interest to that particular person. Now, obviously, at the moment, Ukraine is a massive issue for Russia, for example. The Middle East is a massive issue for the United States. So these issues will all be discussed in bilaterally as the prospective candidates go around. And I have to be honest, and sometimes normally this process leads to a lowest common denominator approach. Now, we've seen that with numerous Secretary Generals in the past, because those who have the sort of status that one would expect from a Secretary General, they stick their head above the parapet. One of the P5 say, don't like the sound of this, they might be a bit too strong, a bit too directing. We don't want someone lecturing us from the UN pulpit. And that's why you tend to get a consensus around someone who isn't going to ruffle the feathers of any of the sort of P5 members. That is, I'm afraid, the sad reality of the situation. There is good news. I mean, there's certainly a general view at the moment that it's the time that there should be a female Secretary General. Of course, there's nothing written down in the Charter about that, but nonetheless, there's a sort of general view. There used to be a very strict regional rotation. That's actually been put aside in the last couple of rotations, but nonetheless, there's a feeling that South America, Latin America's turn. So in all those respects, Rebecca, I think you perhaps have a good chance. But, let's not hide away from the reality. It is still a hard power calculation, and whatever reforms in the process that have been agreed over the last 20 years hasn't changed the basic fact that it is a P5 agreement at the end of the day.
Thanks very much, Mark. Do you have a quick reaction to anything Mark has just sort of presented there before we go to questions? Any of those themes?
Yeah. Well, two things. One, obviously, you have to be elected without the veto of anybody of the P5. You still need the 9 votes from the Security Council. But it's true, and everybody tells you that the process that was put together last time did mean something. It was not the same as before. In what sense? Before, you didn't have to go to any hearing. You didn't have to go to any public. You didn't have to explain anything to anybody. And now you have to. And obviously, the P5 have circles of influence. They are not alone in their desk, you know? They care about what their partners or associates in a certain way think. And so the process is more open today than it was before. It was much more close before. Obviously, the P5 still holds, you know, a lot of power, and even the power, let me say, to choose somebody 5 minutes before there is no deadline to present candidacies. Yes? And so, you know, even if you go through the process, they can decide in the last hour, you know, to have somebody else. But the truth is that last time it didn't happen, you know. The people that went through the process was one of the ones that was selected. So they are a little bit more constraints, let's say, to a total only P5 process, like it was before. That's my first,
Sure.
Reaction to what Mark said. My second point is that the UN has done a lot in these 80 years, despite the P5 always being there. And they have not always been happy with what had happened before, because at the end, the Secretary General has to be able to be active, to be proactive in diplomacy, to take risks, some calculated risk, but still risk. And when you do that, you are able to make a contribution. It's not only what the P5s tell you. So I don't want to sound naive, because none of us is. Yes, we know exactly what the power game is and what politics is, and I have been in politics for a long time. So I am not naive, but also to see the power game like a zero-sum game,
Yeah.
and you know that there is no way to move or no independence and no degrees of freedom. I think that is not the reality we live in.
The biggest
We're going to get to questions in a second, so a quick one.
Last comment on this, though, is that
Yeah.
the biggest reform that I think would be very useful is to have a one-term Secretary General for a longer period, say 7 years. The biggest problem for any newly elected Secretary General is that they're thinking about their re-election after 5 years, because they know from Boutros Ghali's example, for instance, that if you upset one of the P5 during your first 5 years, you're not going to get a second 5 years. Yes, the process of electing someone in the first place is much more open, and that's great, and it does put a little constraint, not much, but a little constraint on the P5. But most important would be to have a single term in the future, and then there is no constraint, you know, at least then the Secretary General can exert whatever authority they can after that.
That has been proposed.
Yeah.
It has not been accepted
Yeah,
yet.
exactly right. Because
Well,
But,
thanks very much. We've got lots of questions. So I'm going to take them in clusters of 2 or 3. So we're going to come straight to the middle. If we can hand the microphone just here.
Thank you. I'm Jane Kinnenmont from the United Nations Association UK, and we are part of a global campaign called 1 for 8 billion, used to be 1 for 7 billion, but things have changed. campaigning for a more open process and various reforms, including a fixed one term, and we would like to see a woman Secretary General. We would very much like to engage you in an ongoing conversation to help make this competition more accessible to the public and increase the scrutiny, perhaps especially inside the P5 countries. But I think my question is, what do you think the UN should do less of, given the budget cuts that it's now facing? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I'm going to ask if you can come to the gentleman just in front, who just there, yourself with the, yep. Just stick your hand up a bit higher so they can see you, yep. Let's get your question as well. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. Anthony Dworkin with European Council on Foreign Relations. So, you know, you've talked about the kind of continued desire of countries around the world to engage with these multilateral fora based around the UN. You know, but still, to be provocative, I would say an honest assessment is that the action, you know, where the action is internationally is not at the UN primarily anymore. It's in kind of Trump style or Turkey-Qatar style peace mediation. In trade, it's not really around the WTO, it's around different kinds of trade deals. In development, it's arguably around kind of infrastructure
let's get to your question,
initiatives and so on. So, you know, what will it take to bring the UN back to the center? Is that still possible? Is there a reform agenda that would do that? Would the United States and China be on board?
Okay, thank you. Let's take these two, and then we'll come to those gentlemen after your answers to those first questions.
So thank you very much for the 1 to 8 billion campaign. And thank you for your question. What is it that we have to do less of? And let me try to expand here a little bit more. First of all, I think that the UN has to change also for the good reasons. And one good reason is that the capacities of countries and organizations today are much more than they were in 1945. We have some nostalgia about what we used to be, but also we used to be much more important in certain issues because there was nobody else. You know, when we went out of the Second World War and we established the UN in 1945. That is not true today. I can tell you about that also. When I was in UNDP, I really fought for this because I said, the countries know much more today. They have much more capacities today. There is an issue of respect also of the good things that have happened during these 80 years. Yeah. And I think that has to be synced in the culture of the UN. And we don't have to do everything and, you know, assume every challenge that is in the world. We have to stick to our core. And when many say back to basics, I say, well, back to Charter, you know, Article 1 of the UN Charter. You know, you go back to Article 1, you will, you know, have the core, yes, and the rest we will have to discuss and we will have to agree. But there is a core that is in the Charter that we have to maintain. This is my first point. So going to UNCTAD and the reform, and I agree with you that I think that the UN has to be more active and more risk taker in peace and security, and to be at the table. And probably I think that the UN can take more risk because even if we fail, yes, we need to show the action that may be possible. Maybe you failed the first time, but you will have to persevere. You have to be very strong in doing that. And failing is not the end of the world, even if, you know, you cannot go only to the secure things. And that is part of the peace and security issue now. We need to be much more active and be more, you know, we have to embrace the power of diplomacy much more, even if the big game and the big powers are there. So I really believe there is much we can do. But UNCTAD and the UN reform. I can tell you that cutting 20% of your budget, yes, you cannot do that unless you reform, if you want to do it well. You can cut 5% and nothing will happen, yes? But you cannot cut 20% and nothing happening. I cut 20% of my labor force in UNCTAD, 20%. This is 1 in 5, yes? I did it because I prepared. For 3 years, I took decisions on the priorities. I took decisions how to assign the capacities in the resources. We are doing better today than we were doing before. We are more relevant. We are more present, with on-time evidence and research. And we do it at the same time that we had less resources and a lot of constraints in, money and posts. So I think that all organizations need reform after a time. And this time, I think that the UN has to take it very seriously to reform and to be effective in the things that nobody else can do. And I think that gathering around that and with the capacities and the legitimacy that the UN has is essential for us to be fit for.
And it won't surprise you to know lots of questions coming online about reform. Eugene James asked, what are the prospects for the UN Security Council reform? Ben Parker asked, does the UN Charter need to be amended to achieve meaningful reform? Mark, I'm going to come to you in a moment. I'm going to get a few more questions, if that's okay, and then you can wrap your answers in. Lots of questions. Let's take the two gentlemen who are sitting next to each other, who happen to raise their hands right at the start, and then I'll come to this side of the room in a moment, okay? Please go ahead.
Firstly, just given Rebecca's...
just introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, Mark MacDonald, Chatham House member. Yep. Just a comment, shouldn't you be advising the UK government on getting more out of less, Rebecca? But my question is, you mentioned sort of three things. One is the 117 small and medium countries and giving them a more unified voice, the P5 voting system, and then reform of the UN. They're obviously inherently linked. Should you abolish the veto of the P5 to give the 117 small and medium countries a bigger voice?
Okay, I assume the P5 would veto that, but yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Jamie Drummond, founder of a group called One and Sharing Strategies. For your leadership on debt and development and climate finance, you have our vote. So thank you, Rebecca, for all of that. Not that that's decisive in any way at this point. But the question is, we've just come out of COP and the G20. Your advice, please, for the British system, which is planning to host the G20 in 2 years' time exactly, which will be within a few days of Ethiopia hosting the African COP. So we've just had our COP G20 confluence in the annual calendar. But in 2 years' time, it's this crew, it's this country that will be co-hosting that moment of diplomatic activity with Addis, with Ethiopia, and with Africa, which forces the British system to pay close attention to what the continent needs, as well as the necessity of climate action.
Move to your question, please. Yeah.
How would you advise the British system to get organised? Because right now it is struggling.
Okay, and I'm going to take one more. The lady right here as well, just in the front. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you very much. Hi, Maria Ramos. I'm a news anchor at TRT World, Turkey's international networker. A question for Secretary-General Rebeca Grynspan. You spoke a lot about risk, the risk that was shown when negotiating the Black Sea grain deal. Where right now should the UN be showing that risk, specifically Gaza, for example, Sudan? Yesterday, the UNCTAD put out an economic report saying that Gaza had shown the worst economic decline on record. Sudan right now, the world's worst humanitarian crisis at the moment. Where is that risk, and what would you do? What would you prioritise if and when you become UN Secretary General?
Brilliant.
Thank you.
I'm actually going to start with Mark. Actually, there's a question about the UK system, but just take any of the themes that you've heard.
Well,
please.
just a word on what the UN should do less. I agree with Rebecca. I don't think the UN, as the sole universal forum, should be withdrawing from whole sectors of what it does. Because the UN family, bear in mind, you've got the programs and the funds, the agencies, all of which are different, cover a very wide span, and it should. I don't see any problem with that. The difficulty is the sunsetting of activity, and I saw a lot of that when I was in the Security Council, in the peacekeeping budget, which, as I mentioned, is larger than the regular budget. Because it's easy to take a decision to set up a peacekeeping operation. It's much more difficult to close it down. And there are multiple examples from Cyprus, from Haiti, from Liberia, the UNRWA, for heaven's sake, that's been in Gaza for 70 years. You know, there needs to be a way of closing down a UN process. And that is a problem at the moment, and I think that's an area where it's worth looking at. The G20 is fascinating. I mean, I wouldn't presume to give the British government sort of advice on sort of managing that process, but it is worth noting that the G20 is a potential rival to the UN in some respects, and it's seen as such by the G173, who are not in the G20, if you like. I was surprised when I got to the UN to find that the G20 was much more hated than the G7 was. The G7, rich countries want to get together, talk among themselves, fine. But the G20, which had the champions of the global south in it, had the Chinas and the Brazils and the South Africas and the Indonesias taking decisions outside the UN forum, which affected these other countries. They were very concerned about that, because they did not have a seat at the table as they do at the UN. So the G20, I think, is an extremely important forum, and I'm sure that Britain's already preparing for its presidency of it. But let's not pretend that it's universally welcomed around the world, because it absolutely isn't.
Rebecca.
I will differ, and that's strange. First of all, because I think that the UN has to work more with regional and different grouping organizations that can make things move. So if I will have to say something to the UK government about the G20 is move the reform on the international financial system. It's not about aid. This is about really leveling the playing field for the developing countries. And we need trade, and we need investment, and we need to crowd in private investment into the countries where that is not happening. And that's what the G20 can do. They can really push the multilateral development banks and the IMF to reform, to make it much more conducive to development in the rest of the world. So I will use the G20 for that, and I will use the voice of the UN system to put the facts out. You know, in the debt issue, for example, where we need a different process for debt restructuring in the world, well, we were one of the ones that put the number out. We said there are 3.4 billion people that today live in countries that spend more in servicing the debt than on health and education. And then suddenly, the world said, oh my God, that is a problem. You know, it's not only about you behave badly and then the debt is your problem. No, there is a huge problem for 40% of the population of the world. And we did that. So the UN can do that. But to push the MDBs or the multilateral development banks or the IMF or the international financial system to change, the G20 can be used much more for that to happen. And I will do that. You know, we went to the G20, we invested in it, we went to the discussions, and we, in a way, we try to influence the narrative and the action that is taken there. And I don't see that as a rivalry. I think that they can be synergies, as long as the G20 don't think that they can do what the UN does. But we have also to recognize that there are things that maybe will have a better success rate if we engage with other organizations. And the same happens in peace and security, let me say. You know, we need the African Union to be more involved in the problems that we have also in Africa and in peace and security.
Let's come to the gentleman right on the end here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Udayveer, and I've just graduated from LM from SOVAS in Public International Law. Now, my question is to the entire panel, which is in a world where private actors are playing an increasingly important role on the global stage, and even now becoming primary drivers in new frontiers, such as deep sea mining and outer space. would it make sense to formally include them in the multilateral system where, with more say, they could be held more accountable for their actions?
And I'm just going to add a question from online, which is a little bit related to the question gentleman has just asked. Questions from Tricia de Boschgrave. She's asking actually about a more digitized world in which some countries are having to choose between US and China technology. And so how is the UN going to meet the challenge of a fractured internet? And I ask this because obviously the internet companies are private companies and non-state actors in that sense. Is this a fundamental challenge to the UN Charter of safeguarding people's human rights, as human rights are expressed in a digital form as well? Let's take those two.
Okay, let me take the second. And I have to ask about the first because I didn't understand exactly. With respect to the digital revolution, precisely there was agreed to have the Global Digital Compact within the UN that have several parts of what the question referred to. And it's very interesting that there was a consensus in doing that. For example, UNCTAD was tasked with data governance that has to do with human rights, it has to do with privacy, it has to do also with the possibility of the countries to be able to regulate or not, and to converge on regulation that makes sense. Because if you do regulation that doesn't make sense, you only hurt everybody. And so in the Digital Compact, you have 5 areas from the digital spectrum where the UN will be working. And obviously, you know, they are very important because nobody else can really have the legitimacy of the universal membership to do that. We are including, obviously, the main actors, yes, in the data governance that we are leading. For example, the private sector is participating. In artificial intelligence, there is a scientific panel to advise the UN in what is the world forward. Because if you don't understand how this works, you know, you won't be able to regulate appropriately on what is happening. So my point here is that the UN is very active in this issue. It's not an easy one because the concentration of power in the digital platforms is very big. But the UN is already active and doing a lot with respect to the question.
Please,
Let me answer that question, because private actors or non-state actors are already very heavily involved in the UN agenda. I mean, there are 5,000 NGOs registered at the United Nations, for instance, all of which have an impact in different particular areas. You've got the Gates Foundation, which gives more money in development overseas than 99% of governments. You've got the 5 top US tech companies that are worth more than 95% of individual member states of the UN. The question you're asking is, should they somehow be bound in or sort of regulated because of the role that they're playing? I think that's a challenge. I mean, as we find, national governments are less powerful than they were some time ago because of these different forces. You know, the British government can't tax Google as it would like to do because it claims it doesn't make any profits in the UK. You know, that's just one example. So I think putting constraints on some of these private actors is going to be very, very difficult. But they can do a lot of good. And people like the Gates Foundation, people like all these NGOs at the UN absolutely have an impact on the agenda and play, on the whole, a very positive role. So I wouldn't want to stop them doing that by trying to chain them down too much.
Thank you so much. And I am so sorry that we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions. You might be interested to know, not a mathematical calculation, but both online and in the audience, so about 30% of people I can sort of see participating wanted to ask questions. There's a lot of you in the room. So I'm really sorry you can't get to everybody's questions, but I want to thank Mark and to thank Rebeca really sincerely for coming in and for, I think, having such a stimulating discussion that both conveys the importance of the UN, the gravity and plethora of the challenges that are facing it, but also the optimism of people who are working within the system to use those levers for the global good. So let's all give a round of applause to our panellists. Thank you. That was brilliant. Thank you so much.